It's my pleasure to welcome you today to a session with Dr. Richard Lum entitled A Map with No Edges, the Ramifications of Future Operating Environments. And before introducing and turning to Richard, let me just say a few words to set the context here. Here at the Center for Global Security Research, we spend a lot of time thinking about the future, especially about the future of conflict. We try to anticipate it with studies of the strategies, intentions, and capabilities of adversaries. We try to prepare for it with studies of deterrence and defense, and we try to shape it with thinking about long-term competitive and cooperative strategies. And of course, we sit in a laboratory culture that spends a lot of time worrying about geopolitical and technical surprise and how to hedge effectively against such surprises. But does this mean that we as a center and as a laboratory and as part of a national security community are actually good at thinking about the future? A flurry of high-level assessments recently strongly suggests that we at the national level at least are not. My touchstone on this is the request in 2015 from Secretary of Energy Moniz for help in challenging our ways of thinking about the future so as to better anticipate and prepare for strategic surprise. But there are many touchstones, many leadership calls for clearer thinking in this area. I think the most compelling recent one is the statement in the National Defense Strategy of 2018, which called upon the U.S. defense community to wake up from 25 years of strategic atrophy and to, quote, outthink, outpartner, and out-innovate our adversaries. And so that suggests we can get better. If so, how? And I find myself as the manager of a research center often thinking about these questions, but in a context in which the rate of change around us is clearly accelerated. And as more and more people perceive that we're at a significant inflection point in the international system, which is likely to bring significant new and different forms of conflict to us as a problem. At a recent meeting of the CGSR research staff, we talked about how to get better about thinking at the future. And Zach Davis, who directs one of our projects on strategic latency, spoke up and said, I know exactly who we need to hear from on this topic. And that's Dr. Richard Lum, who I'm pleased to welcome back to the center. He's been a participant in some of our workshops. Richard is CEO of Vision Foresight Strategy, a limited liability corporation. He's an academically trained futurist with a doctorate in political science from the Future Studies program at the University of Hawaii. He's based in Hawaii, where he provides analytic support to Indo-Pacific and to other clients such as US SOCOM, NASA, various private entities, as well as foreign governments, including those of Singapore, Canada, and the UK. He's, to keep a foot in the Washington environment, he's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. And he's made a significant name for himself as an author and, in Zach's word, provocateur, who challenges effectively the way conventional wisdom clutters our thinking about the future and helps us to think differently. So, Richard, thank you very much for joining us. Before I turn it to you, let me remind the group of the rules. The session is being recorded, but not the Q&A portion. Richard will speak for roughly 45 minutes to frame an argument for us to react to, and then we'll take questions from the chat function. If you wish to raise your hand and ask your question personally, that's fine too. But in the chat function, please send your message either to me or to the panelists. If you send it to the sponsor or host, the host, it will end up somewhere else. So I will then try and keep the conversation flowing and get all the questions in. Without further ado, Richard, let me turn it over to you. Thanks again for joining us.
Hey, thank you very much, Brett, and thank you very much for that introduction. Excuse me. It is a pleasure to be here and to be back with the center. And good morning to everybody, or good afternoon, as the case may be. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the challenges in thinking about the future, stuff that Brad had just been referencing. And we're going to talk a little bit about the future of conflict and what some of that might mean for us moving forward. Now, for all of us, the last 6 months have been a period of crisis, right? One of multiplying uncertainties, rising anxiety. We had the pandemic, and before that was even fully sort of developed, we started having, national civil unrest over racial injustice. And when we're looking at the year, the disruptions probably won't stop there. We have the election coming up, which just may add a third sequential disruption to our society. But even before everything that's happened so far in 2020, the world had been undergoing some significant transitions. Geopolitically, the world is shifting, and certainly folks involved with the center are deeply, deeply into looking at that stuff. The climate is changing, right? And right now we're seeing some of those impacts, things that we've talked about for years that now really we can't sort of ignore and escape. We're creating vast, invisible digital landscapes that structure our lives, and we are developing novel technologies to recode life itself and to generate novel machine ecosystems. There are many forces setting in motion fundamental changes today, and a great many actors pursuing specific changes in the landscape. It has perhaps never been more important for us to think hard about what the future operating environment looks like, and probably never more challenging to do that effectively. One of the things that we can do is to start taking a more expansive view about thinking about the future, taking a more expansive approach. Right? By doing this, we can uncover more blind spots, we can anticipate more threats, and better understand the non-obvious outcomes. And we can identify a broader array of opportunities and equip ourselves to see where and how we can create more opportunity. We can do all that by taking a more expansive approach to the question of, right, what is the future operating environment? First, a little bit about me and about future studies. So I grew up in Hawaii, in Honolulu. It's a tough gig, and I took that hit for the rest of you. I grew up a science fiction geek. Being born and raised in Hawaii, I went to the University of Hawaii and was nearing the end of my undergraduate training, right? I just needed a few more credits, and I was a political science major, so I needed just some elective credits so that I could graduate. And I was kind of desperate to get out of college at that point. Being a science fiction nerd, and probably just being a little bit lazy, to be honest, I was looking for something easy to take so I could get out of college. So one day I'm walking across campus, I've got the registration book in my hand, and I'm flipping through it, and I come across this class. Design a government on Mars. That sounded both science fiction-y and easy. I was sold. It was like, okay, let's do this. So I totally signed up for it. I didn't realize it at the time, but this was Professor Jim Dater's only undergraduate course in his introductory course to the field of future studies and the program that he started and ran at the University of Hawaii. Future studies is a little known and often misunderstood academic field that is centrally concerned with trying to understand and anticipate change in society. And using that insight, right, what we might otherwise call foresight, to help people reframe both their expectations for what could happen, as well as their preferences for what they want to see happen. So future studies as a whole deals with both forecasting and foresight, so the understanding and anticipating change part of it, as well as the aspiration and vision part of it, taking action to shape a better future than the ones that other people are making for you. And of course, most clients come to us for the former, right? Most are coming for the foresight part of it. And really, if we're honest, most clients in their heart of hearts are really hoping that we can tell them exactly what will happen tomorrow. And foresight is not prediction, right? Despite how much my clients and friends love introducing me as the guy who's bringing the crystal ball to the meeting, they didn't hand me one at graduation. Or if they were handing them out, I wasn't paying attention, and so I didn't get one. And so I'm stuck doing real work. Foresight is best thought of as insight into how and why the future may be different from the present. And in the futures program and in the futures field in general, we get taught sort of these three core precepts, right? And the first one is the future is unwritten. The future does not exist. You can't study it. You can't collect data on it. The future is not sitting down around the corner, idling, waiting to be whistled up. The future does not exist. As a consequence, there are multiple possible futures, and those possible futures are constantly in flux. Now, the work that we do does typically entail a range of things. There are various types of historical analysis. There's, of course, lots of trends and those types of things, a whole mess ton of scenarios and those kinds of things, and sometimes with clients doing preferred futures or visioning and stuff like that. Now, in the work that we do, there is a very wide range of methods and tools that get deployed to help clients with this question about the future, right? And trying to understand, anticipate change and using that insight, right? There is a great many different ways of thinking about the future, right? So in our work, we got taught many different theories of change that are operating at different levels. There are a wide variety of analytical methods that you can choose from. There are, of course, qualitative and quantitative forecasting methods. There is a whole bunch of different scenario methodologies. There is, in the course of our work with clients, we absolutely do work in workshops where you're actually with folks with Post-its in the room, helping them actually generate the foresight themselves. And there's other work that we're doing, of course, at our desk, generating the stuff on our own, so to speak. There are small group assessment work that you do in approaches like that. And then there are folks using crowdsourcing, trying to use that stuff to help develop foresight. So there is across the field, and when you look at professionally trained foresight professionals, there's a wide array of approaches, methodologies, and techniques that we do employ, again, to help folks think about the future and to get into this question about how and why might the future be different from today, and what can we do with some of that insight. And we do use a wide variety of these methods, right? A lot of different analytical methods, a lot of different forecasting methods to choose from. If you strip all of that away, at the most basic level, we're developing foresight with folks to try to do two things. We're trying to inform and we're trying to inspire, right? So on the one hand, we want to avoid getting the really bad stuff wrong, right? So like anticipating that future public health crises, like pandemics, would disproportionately impact minority and marginalized groups, stuff we've talked about with clients. And at the same time, we want to inspire, right? We want to identify more of the actual opportunities for defining new spaces, like exploring how trends in automation and developments in energy and communication could be brought together to change the calculus of logistics for US forces and favorably alter battlefield geometry, right? Stuff like that. We are trying to do both with folks, right? We're trying to both inform and inspire through the foresight work. One of the ways you can think about this approach to the future, right, is to think in terms of sort of this expanding cone of possibilities, right? And so when you think about it this way, there is a range of possibilities for any one topic that we're looking at. And within that range, right, the farther out we think, there is this, as you can see, this band of what we call low change scenarios, right? These are outcomes in which important stuff doesn't change. Systems don't, key systems, assumptions, what you would teach the next generation, all of these things don't really change. Black is a new pink, and, there is change. It's just not significant and deep, right? These are low change scenarios. Clients shouldn't need our help with this, right? This is the kind of stuff they think about all the time. The places that folks usually need help with, and we all need help with it sometimes, is to map those bands of high change, right? Because these are the places in which, and it gets more likely the further out in time we're thinking, these are the outcomes, the scenarios, right? The different possible futures that are meaningfully divergent from the way things are today. And a lot of times those are not intuitive, or there's parts of us that just don't want to think about those things. But for a number of reasons, right? It's more difficult to get folks out to expand that, to map those bands of high change. And so we actually really sort of see our work as being about helping folks map those spaces, right? Because again, they really shouldn't need too much help from me to sort of map out what goes on in those bands of low change, right? Now, as I mentioned, I grew up a big science fiction fan. So one day, just a few years ago, I'm at the movie theater and I'm watching Star Trek Beyond, right? The movie with Chris Pine, for the Trekkies out there, the alternate, J.J. Abrams stuff. But I'm watching this movie, right? And so, spoiler alert, the Enterprise blows up and crashes onto this planet, and everybody has to bail out. And so Kirk's in this escape pod. He's burning down to the planet. He crashes. He gets out. He starts putting on all these, all the survival gear. So he's got his coat. He's got his phaser. He's got his communicator. He pulls out the communicator and he flips it open and he starts calling for people. And right in that moment, I have this intense envy because I'm looking up at the screen and I'm like, oh, I wish I had that. And then it struck me the absurdity of that thought, because in my pocket, right, I had this. I had a modern, powerful smartphone. And as everybody on the call knows, right, these things are vastly more powerful and versatile than Kirk's communicator. It does everything Kirk's communicator does and way more, right? So the modern smartphone has come to play this important role in shaping and impacting, right, so many aspects of the world that we live in today, right? And so when we think about that, this smartphone, right, has been changing and reshaping all kinds of things, right? So people are using it to genuinely get access to care, right? We use smartphones as components to prosecute combat operations. People literally use smartphones to manage companies, right? We create all manner of content through these things. Nowadays, increasingly, right, we're using them for public health surveillance systems, right? The smartphone and the ecosystems of technology around it power a wide variety of business models and industries, right? This thing has become a critical enabler of many of the systems we have come to rely on in the world today. And yet, it wouldn't necessarily have been obvious, say back in the 90s, right, just before these things started coming out, that this is the impact that this emerging technology would have had on the world, right? So if we jump back, right, to the 90s, and some of you might remember that there was this concept called UbiComp, right, ubiquitous computing, and we got it right, and we got it kind of wrong, right? So the original vision for UbiComp and a lot of the way it was discussed coming out of the 90s, right? It was this image of, hey, we're going to have this built environment that has computing and sensing and communication, and we're going to have this really interesting built environment that's going to sense us and do things and interact with us. And there was this sense that through this stuff, to achieve this stuff, we were going to do it by, either building new sort of high-tech infrastructure, or we were going to retrofit the built environment, right? We were going to retrofit buildings and rooms and all this kind of stuff. Well, as it turns out, we did get to ubiquitous computing, and to a big extent, we got to it through the smartphone, right? And so we got it kind of right, and we got it kind of wrong. But if you go back to the 90s, right? So if you go back to just before the period when smartphones were appearing, it's this question of what conversations would you had to have had, right, to consider the pathways of change that would lead to this single device being such a keystone technology, right, and such a keystone object, right? That would have required far more than just extrapolations of consumer retail trends, or looking at first-order applications of telecommunication developments at the time, right? There's no straight line extrapolation from the pagers we were rocking then to this future, right? Somewhere in that story is Steve Jobs and the iPhone, right? iTunes and the app economy that very rapidly emerged, right? GPS access, the boom of Silicon Valley, China as a manufacturing engine, right? These are all the types of things that your conversations about what's the future of smartphones would have needed to have for you to get close to some of these possibilities. And we can take another example, right, of the impact of smartphones. We can look at the impact they've had in things like terrorism and violence, right, and looking at the role, right, that smartphones have played cross this global war on terror that we, right, started prosecuting in the 2000s, right? And the role that the smartphone has played in things like communication and recruitment, social media, coordination, right, as a pathway for counterterrorism operations, sensitive site exploitation, right, all of this kinds of stuff. And the role that smartphones played in helping a violent extremist organization like ISIS, right, rise to power, gain air power, right? This is an organization that achieved air superiority with commercial off-the-shelf gear against the US Air Force in the fullness of its conventional power, right? So going back to the 90s, what avenues of thought would you had to have gone down to consider the possibility of these events, right? That's not just an exploration of a technology, right? But of systems of technologies, of the industries that grew up around those technologies, of geopolitics, series of related future conflicts, religion, all of those things play these intersecting roles in creating these possibilities, one of which we ended up living through. Now, another example of the pivotal role, right, of smartphones has been in creating tactical, operational, and intelligence threats for US forces. So today, with a few bucks, just about any actor, individual or group, can access data and information services, right, to sometimes develop scary accurate pictures of individuals and groups, right, about the location, daily habits, preferences, behaviors, right, and they can use all of that data that they develop to develop influence operations. And through these devices, right, that we all carry, we are, of course, leaving huge digital footprints through life, right? So going dark today is an increasingly difficult objective. And for the average person, it's a non-starter, right? And again, going back in time, you couldn't have anticipated this particular state of affairs by just thinking about how maybe you could track people's location in the future with pings off cell phone towers, right? This is a story of the internet, of Web 2.0, the emergence of social media, of smartphones setting all of that on fire, which leads us to this issue around surveillance capitalism and its emergence, and ultimately to the inversion of the consumer as the product. All right, so again, your conversation, your discussions about what's the future of smartphones back in the day would have had to have been able to cover all of these different angles, right, to get close to talking about or uncovering some of these very real possibilities. And as a final example, going back, who would have thought that smartphones, right, things that we see sort of as the evolution of like pages that were on your hip, would end up having geopolitical implications, right? So today we're in this global competition. It's a geotechnological competition. Economically, we're basically frenemies with China at this point. And smartphones sit within all of this, right? And so as of very recently, for example, Chinese companies, right, were making big inroads into smartphone markets and smart speaker markets and all of these kinds of things. These devices, right, become elements in the information infrastructure that is emerging around the world, right? And, parts of the kinds of societal surveillance systems that China's developing and that it's advancing, right, and selling and managing around the world, right? And this has become so much so that connected devices as a category and their prohibition as a matter of security policy become front page news. So back in the 90s, to explore this type of possible outcome, you would have had to consider that the theory that a more developed country and middle class country becomes more liberal, that maybe that theory is wrong. You would have had to think about possible evolutionary pathways for US economic and diplomatic relations with countries around the world in relation to those with China. You would have had to think about the evolution of US technology firms and the development and intersection with things like cyber threats, machine learning, facial recognition, right? Again, all of these comes together to shape sort of the environment that we're going through right now. And so if you had gone back, again, your conversations would have needed to be able to touch on many of these types of things. And so who thinks that someone back in the 90s wielding what was then cutting edge 2x2 scenario matrix like the one shown here would have come anywhere close to exploring all of the possibilities and pathways relevant for a discussion about the future of the smartphone, right? Even if they had taken maybe an MBA approach at the time and they had built a neat little model about consumer electronic growth, right? How could they possibly have come close to envisioning all the different types of events and changes that came to create this world around the smartphone? And this is for something as relatively narrow and straightforward as smartphones, right? What about when we turn to issues that are much more deeply concerned, that we're much more deeply concerned with, and issues that are much more complex, right? What about when we think about the future of education and learning, the future of health and well-being in the United States, right? The future of human conflict? To begin to come close to thinking rigorously about the future of these topics, we have to employ a variety of perspectives, a variety of approaches, and many methods. Now, speaking of cutting edge in the 90s, so I was a student at the University of Hawaii back there. Again, you're welcome for me taking that hit for you. And at the time, I was a new future student. I was just getting into it and wanted to learn a lot more. So I went to the library and signed into the computer lab to find a open Carol with a computer to access the internet, and to get on the listserv and ask the other folks in the futures community, for suggestions on reading about scenarios. And one of the older, wiser, more experienced futures folk immediately sent back the recommendation that I read this book, The Art of the Long View. And so this was my first piece of sort of structured reading, getting into it as I was getting into the futures program. And this book is probably the most famous book on scenarios and scenario thinking. It certainly was probably the introduction that most of corporate America got to the idea about thinking about the future in terms of scenarios, from the 90s into the 2000s. And this was written by Peter Schwartz, who came from Shell Oil. He co-founded the Global Business Network, and which had an amazing meteoric rise in the 90s and whatnot. Very much built on their method of looking at the future in terms of multiple scenarios, right? And so this was a lot of people's first introduction to the concept of scenarios and the notion of structured thinking about alternative scenarios beyond just what if, what if, what if. And importantly, the notion that we're doing that exercise specifically to identify and explore divergent alternatives, right? And when this came out, this was not a mainstream notion. It certainly was not a mainstream notion in corporate America. And so lots of folks doing strategic planning and other analysis about the environment weren't necessarily taking the sort of approach to thinking about it. And this is, right, the approach that GBN popularized. They called it scenario planning. So most of what you hear about in terms of scenario planning derives from this or is this. This is probably the most prevalent scenario method used in North America. And most of you on the call today who have been involved in scenario work probably have been exposed or did something like this, right? So it's the most recognized method of thinking in terms of multiple futures. And a lot of times when you say scenarios, people imagine this 2x2 framework. Now, again, when this came out, it was not mainstream thinking. Today, of course, it has moved up the S-curve and is, frankly, part of the new normal. Thinking in terms of multiple scenarios, doing that as a regular activity, as part of analysis and planning and all that stuff, is now a mainstream thing. Right? All of these reports that you can see here, all of them feature scenario approaches, scenario discussions, the scenarios themselves. And as somebody once joked, if it shows up in a government report, it can't possibly be leading edge. Sorry, but it's a funny joke. And so, this kind of approach, right? So understanding and thinking about the world in terms of multiple possible outcomes and taking those possible outcomes seriously, right, has moved up to be a very commonplace way of looking at stuff. Now, the smartphones that we were talking about was a great historical example for thinking about the future. A current issue, right, and one that most of us here today are engaged with in some way, has to do with the future operating environment for the US military. And to think about the future operating environment is to think about the future of conflict. So let's explore it for a bit. Now, trying to be good researchers and analysts and trying to learn from history, we'll start by taking, multiple approaches to this topic, right? So we'll start with trends. Now, key building block in good foresight work Trends are descriptions of history. They are changes that have been occurring over time up until about now, right? Trends represent the just recent momentum of change. Now, one of the key things is we tend to act and treat trends like they tell us the future, and they don't. They imply something about what's coming next. And all trends bend or break at some point, right? Which is how we often get tripped up. Yet, they are key building blocks and they are important indicators about the direction, the shape of change, right? So we start with some of these things. So if we start with things like broad trends, right? Things that are relevant to human conflict, we can see some of these big things that others have talked about, at length: urbanization, littoralization, digitization of society, connectivity, right? These are some of the big, broad trends that you often start with. There's a ton more that we could be looking at, right? Rise of populism, nationalism, authoritarianism trends, right? Combining that with what other researchers have identified and coined as hollowing out of the state. We can look at, the technological contest that has emerged between the centralizing and decentralizing possibilities around technology, right? But when we start with these things, right, and we proceed from some of these trends, right? Some of the things that suggest themselves, right? What takes us to this place today where we are seeing, right, empowered actors and more of them, right, seeking and capable of seeking change. Right? We are looking at a world that is turning into something where the built environment, and particularly the digital built environment, is becoming a defining landscape of conflict and competition. Right? We're looking at the diffusion of capabilities, right? Things that before you needed to be rich, powerful to be able to do, right? The ability to accrue power, right, to make intended things happen is diffusing. And then, of course, populations are once again in play, right? So today, populations are targets, populations are the subjects of competition, and populations become a medium through which we are competing with each other. Now, proceeding from some of these trends, right, we immediately start to think about and look at some very interesting ideas. An example would be this idea of adopting a ThreeWorld view, right? Proceeding from some of those types of trends, right? We can start to contrast. Hey, most of us grew up thinking about the world in sort of this bifurcated lens, right? The natural world and the man-made world, right? And a lot of us have always talked about that. And then we talk about the overlap and those kinds of things. Well, increasingly, right, based on the trends we're seeing, technology development and business development, all these things, it starts to suggest itself that maybe the valuable thing that we need to do is to adopt this three-world view, right? The natural world, the human world, and the machine world, right? And seeing these different ecosystems interconnected, interlaced, overlapping, and distinct from one another, right? And so you have these important questions that you're looking at, and you're asking, well, hey, when I start to take this view and I use this lens, what do I see? What jumps out at me, right? Questions like, how will the emergence of machine ecosystems impact, right, the relationship between the natural and human worlds, and then the interaction between all three, right? Because you start to sort of anticipate that all three of these realms have actors that are doing things on their own, right? Complexity and all of that goodness, right? So this idea of adopting a three-world view of what we're looking at. Another idea would be this idea that, today, everyone is potentially an innovator, right? When we look at these trends again, given the digital nature of the technologies that are diffusing, given connectivity and the access to information and each other, the global connectivity that enables the easy movement of data as well as material, right? We start to think about how, in contrast to past eras, today, potentially everyone who is connected to us is potentially an innovator and could produce some idea, some thing, some concept, some service that literally becomes an innovation in the pursuit of conflict or competition for somebody, right? And so what happens when we start to look at the world through that lens and start to understand that it's not, right, just the labs, it's not just corporate research labs, it's not just governments, it's not even just companies, right? Starting to understand that because of how interaction is shifting and changing, anyone potentially is an innovator, right, out in the world. And so we're looking at these things, again, we're trying to find these things, not, again, simply to guess what's going to happen, right, and not simply just to identify potential threats. We're also using this whole discussion and all of this analysis to try and identify opportunities, right, possibilities that we like, possibilities that we can create. right? So if we're looking at the world in terms of, hey, you know what, everyone is potentially an innovator. Well, we're in a global competition right now, right? And we now talking about everyone potentially being an innovator, right? How could we nurture new clusters of innovation? What could those clusters be about, right? Maybe they're not even geographic, right? How could we nurture, right, new hubs and clusters of innovation? And we're not talking about Silicon Valley VC type innovation, but innovations across an array of things, like in economics and economic life, societal resilience in the face of these big challenges, right? Innovations in political technology, right? The question is, right, and the opportunity is, how can we take advantage of these possibilities to, for example, support the emergence of societies more resilient to our adversaries' strategies and aims, right? That's the kind of stuff that we're looking for. Now, if we take a different approach, right, we could talk about emerging issues. Trends are an important building block of good foresight work. Emerging issues are another one, right? Whereas trends are described in history, emerging issues are different. Emerging issues are trying to identify things that are fringe or experimental today. And if they survive up the S-curve and get to be mainstream, could have an important role in shaping the stuff that we care about, right? And emerging issues are future technologies, they're sort of unrecognized future public policy issues, they're ideas, concepts, models, things that today are not mainstream, they're fringe, they're experimental, but could grow up to have a big impact. And they are, by definition, things that are likely to sound far-fetched or outlandish to the average person. And we can look at one example. So back in 2014, we were working on some of this stuff, and we were looking at the emergence of smart cities. At the same time, we were looking at the issue of the lack of governance in various urban spaces, right? This was the issue of feral cities. So what happens at the intersection of those two, right? What do feral cities look like? What happens when the technologies of smart cities diffuse into these quote unquote ungoverned spaces, right? What would that mean for US forces, right? And this is the kind of conversation that you actually hear more and more about today. Now, recalling our earlier conversation about adopting a ThreeWorld view, right? That can inform leading from looking at smart feral cities to anticipating the emergence of machine ecosystems, right? And we could take all of this a step further and look at what we call objects of hostile intent, right? We are used to thinking about our built environment, like cities, like rooms, like cars, as inert. We're the actors, right? We move through them. But what happens when, like a jungle, the built environment is no longer neutral and no longer passive, right? And thus you have this issue around object of hostile intent. And so it's looking at these kinds of emerging issues, identifying them, right? And then exploring what this means for us. We could take another example, right? So persistent mutating conflicts, right? One of the things you start to see and that thus start to anticipate is that conflicts, a conflict occurs, it draws in new actors, it crosses boundaries. As it does all those things, it's shifting domains, it's shifting form. And so you've got this idea about this concern about conflict that doesn't end, right? It just keeps morphing and moving on. You have another emerging issue, which we call the ideational descendants of ISIS, right? For whatever ISIS is doing today in the world, one of the things it's likely to be important for is as a historical precedent, right? And so not in terms of ideology, right, but in terms of ideation, right? What impact will the precedent of ISIS have on future generations of disaffected, marginalized populations, right? And so what will be the ideational descendants of ISIS and what they've done and what they've innovated and all that stuff, right? And then you can take a third emerging issue, right? Immortal leadership. Folks are working today on trying to be able to create the usable digital facsimiles of us. You create a lot of social media, and they're trying to use all of that data to create a virtual version of you that, for example, could continue to operate on Twitter even after you've passed away, right? So looking at this issue of, hey, great leaders passing away, but having enough data and building these digital facsimiles that there is still something that can interact, that can speak, that can inspire, right? So what happens when we can knock off, right, the head of a bad actor group, but for all intents and purposes, they're jamming away in the digital space, continuing to inspire the next generation of whatever, right? So we began exploring, what does it mean when all of these various developments intersect and come together? Now, again, we're not doing this just to sort of identify, well, that's a threat, that's a threat, that's a threat, right? We are trying to use all of this discussion, all of this work, to look for opportunities. Right? In this case, right, as with the other stuff, right, where it's about the possibilities that these suggest for new opportunities, right? So here, we could be looking at the shift in special operations forces, right, away from the counterterrorism fight to other key activities, and we might have some new ideas about reorienting SOF. Right? Maybe we generate some new ideas about redefining special forces for the future, right? So when we're thinking about some of these environments, right, what does foreign and internal defense look like in some of these futures, right? Security force assistance. What does unconventional warfare look like in these contexts? Right? So it's this question, this opportunity of how could we reframe SOF key activities to shape these possibilities, right? So what new competencies and skills would we want for small teams, not just to operate and survive in these kinds of environments, but to actually be able to drive and shape some of these environments, right? That's the kind of stuff we're looking for. Finally, we can take a different approach, and we can look at it through the lens of transitions, right? And looking at how, every system, everything has, an existing order or a previous order, and eventually that sort of falls out and something succeeds it. And in this case, in this particular framework, right, we're looking at how we have a current or previous order and how many of the structures or assumptions that undergird that order, right, the way the system is configured, are losing their fitness for purpose as the environment changes. And at the same time, because the environment is changing, there are new technologies, ideas that are inspiring other actors to want to strive for to shape some new order to replace the old order, right? So you're looking at this idea of transitions. When we take this kind of view, right, certainly we're looking at how assumptions and structures are falling away. A lot of us probably used to think there are universal values. I think more people question that today. There are norms around war and sovereignty that seem to be, rapidly eroding. There used to be assumptions that U.S. flagged companies are automatically patriotic and on our side. Hey, economic interdependence prevents conflicts, and we're not so sure about that anymore, right? People used to think, hey, digital tools are inherently democratizing, and I don't think everybody believes that anymore, right? And these are all of these structures and assumptions about the present, about the world order, about how things are arranged, that have been under pressure and are losing their fitness. And at the same time, right, along that red line, you have any number of emerging issues and ideas that are rising up in maturity, right? And thus we start to be concerned with the issue around wavering corporate allegiance. Hey, so if there's a for real fight, or our companies are on our side, or whose side are the companies on? There's conflict around, trying to own and define the next technological revolution. There are more leading edge ideas around virtual nations and the emergence of those things on the global stage. And then there's things like mechanarchy, right, which is a notion about new types of governance systems. And in this case, partly about how you might be able to embed the constitutional order in the built environment because of the changes in technology. And you're looking at all of that stuff and how it informs existing actors and inspires them, how it actually can drive new actors, and all of the competing visions for what the future order is about, right? And that stuff feeding back to looking at this transition period in which we normally develop scenarios, right? This is looking at all the various pathways from here to there that emerge in all of that conflict, all that competition and cooperation over these different visions for what we want the future order to look like, right? And so here, one of the things we're looking at is like norms, and looking at, norms and actors and the unraveling of some of those things, and the strategies that folks are trying to pursue to shape all of that stuff, right? Folks that are invested in the old order, frankly, like the United States, our tendency is to drive for strategies that push that blue line out to the right as desperately as possible, while actors who don't like the blue line, and there are a lot of them, right, who are excited and animated by the red line, of course they have different visions of what the red line leads to, right, they are all in various ways trying to accelerate that red line curve, right? And in the middle, right, we have our transition and the glory and the turbulence that we have there. Now, taking that kind of view, right, and because of the importance of things like norms and existing actors, new actors, right, what are the visions, what are the narratives, we actually can start looking at, this question of what new norms could we develop, right? What new norms and arrangements could we build, right, in the gaps left by unraveling institutions, right, given the emerging contexts and the emerging or potential actors of importance in the future, right? So you're looking at how you can take a lot of these things and you're asking, well, hey, how can we create new types of communities, right? New alliances, new institutions, right? And not just, hey, a new set of partnerships, right? But you might be redefining what partnership means, right? You might be redefining what important community means. And then there's questions about technology, right? What role could technology play in allowing us, as all of these norms and rules are loosening, right, to get in there and use some of that space to define new stuff, right? What role could technology play, right? And just to throw stuff out there, right? Imagine a treaty built on smart contract platforms, right? Self-enforcing treaties. And so you're looking at things, you're trying to look at these opportunities. That's the stuff that we get to, right? That's the stuff that we want to find and identify, right? So that we can actually get engaged and shape where some of this is going, rather than just sitting back and asking, well, which one do we think is most likely going to hit us, right? Now, everything that we've been talking about are building blocks, right? They're possibilities that are presenting themselves as we begin to think about the future of conflict. And they're possibilities that clearly take us in a variety of different directions, right? They begin to map out sometimes a fairly wide range of unique outcomes. And this is just a really quick and brief look, right? We haven't touched on so many things and areas that need to be explored when we're contemplating the future of conflict, right? There's economic change, there's social change, generational change, there are the environmental realities of tomorrow. Oh, and there's bio, which needs a whole entire semester on its own, right? And all of this very brief discussion is before we even begin to use any of the scenario forecasting methods to try and additionally really, right, and more rigorously map some of that range of futures, right? The wealth of insights that we generate about how and why things will change, right, and where we can create opportunities to shape change when we take a more expansive approach to thinking about the future is enormous, right? And the longer you spend working this problem set, right, thinking about the future, the more it becomes an imperative to take a more expansive approach. There is no answer, capital A, to the question, what is the future of conflict? There is no single future of conflict. There is, however, a question we can ask that has an answer. And that question is, what do you want the future of conflict to be about? What do you want the future operating environment to look like? And how do you want the future assessment of US advantages and adversary disadvantages to net out? This is a question that we can answer. And here's the kicker, right? Others have definitively answered this question, right? As the military loves to remind us, hey, the enemy gets a vote, right? Competitors get a move. And all the various actors who were dissatisfied with the previous status quo, they stepped up to the game, they started innovating, and they have been reshaping what was then the future operating environment to their liking. As we were seeing with some of these trends, with more people today being empowered to pursue change in the world, the game is going to start getting crowded. So, right, the world is changing, and it's changing fast. A lot of actors are pursuing change on many levels. If we want to enjoy, like truly enjoy, what comes next, then we need to make this shift to thinking about the future in a more expansive way. We want to be nuanced and critical in thinking about the future of conflict. And we want to continually explore it from new angles. We want to move from thinking of the future as a single outcome, making statements that articulate a single view of tomorrow, to truly thinking about it as a constantly evolving range of possibilities. And in making this shift, there are some obvious and immediate ramifications. Right? So the rules of the world are being rewritten. Change is afoot. So it is time to start defining a preference for something new. And I dare say we might call that a vision. Yesterday is gone, not to return. So given what all is in flux and the possibilities we can start to see, what new preferences can we articulate? We're not the only player, right? We're not the only power on the board. And we've never been able to control where things go. So we don't want to try for some hyper-specific single future, right? We want to think about a range of futures, a range of future operating environments that we might prefer. Essentially, we need to define a range of outcomes that constitute wins for us. Flowing from that, if we're talking about preferences for the future, and those preferences not being wishing for the past, then we have to shift to talking more about driving change. Right? This is a shift to shaping orientation. Right? In our strategy, policy portfolios, we want to rebalance to putting more weight on the shaping side of the strategy house and a little bit less on the hedging side. And so for a long time, we've been the incumbent, right? The market maker. And while we were, everyone else on the planet were competitors. And they thought like competitors. It's a long past time we stop thinking like an incumbent and start thinking like a competitor. And this is about things like wrestling with how can we shake off the reflex of assuming that our position or preference is the default position of the world. That's deeply inborn in a lot of us, right? And that's something that we need to wrestle with, right? So it's this question of how do we start thinking like a true competitor, right? Like somebody who is hungry for a chance and actually hungry for change, right? Rather than sort of cowering against the notion that the world is going to change. And finally, as a lot of you are probably aware, as we make that shift, we will need to update a lot of the constructs that we use day in and day out to assess the world, right? To think about change, to plan, to execute. Right? We're talking about things like strategy frameworks, policy linkages, et cetera, right? This final ramification is really anticipating that genuine shifts in worldview and thinking always require change within institutions, right? In terms of process, language, incentives, right? You can't imagine that it will be easy. And we've done it before, a few times before, in fact, right? And we could totally do it again. So how can we lean into this? Well, the events of this year have genuinely disrupted things, right? So previous conversations that we might have been having about the future operating environment need to be refreshed, and they need to be refreshed now, right? If you happen to be currently involved in a project, then right now, right, add a new approach to the effort, right? Expand the conversation, add another lens, expand the view, right? The world is in flux, as we've been saying. You can also connect with folks to really talk about, like very seriously focus on, what are the opportunities that may be opening up right now? It's in flux, right? That means things are loosening, things are shifting, they're not settled. Other people try to help create that, right? And so they're rushing around trying to use that to advantage. It still presents advantages to us, right? Opportunities for us. And finally, what are some of the really compelling ideas about the future operating environment, about the future of conflict that you've maybe been harboring and you haven't yet shared? Now is an excellent time to introduce those into the conversation, right? We need more and more diverse thinking about what the future of conflict could be about than less, right? So now's the time to jump into that conversation. Again, the world is in flux, right? It's going through an extended period of very significant change. As the incumbent, as the former hyperpower, one of our reflexes is to resist the changes occurring and to see most of what's going on simply as threat. By taking a more expansive approach to thinking about the future, we can do a better job of anticipating more of the genuine threats. And we can better see the broadening array of possibilities we have, right? And can create for ourselves to shape the emerging landscape. If the enemy gets a vote, then we sure as hell do too. So let's take it. And with that, thank you.
Thank you, Richard. That was great.